Good morning. Let's stand up and worship together.
Called sin and shame. They were like prisons that we couldn't escape. But he came and he died and he rose. Those walls are rubble now. Remember those giants we called death and grave. They were like mountains that stood in our way. But he came and he died and he rose. Those giants are dead now. This is our God, this is who he is. He loves us. This is our God, this is what he does. He saves us. He bore the cross, beat the grave. Let heaven and earth proclaim, this is our God, King Jesus. Remember that fear that took our breath away. Faith so weak that we could barely pray. But he heard every word, every whisper. Now those altars in the wilderness tell the story of his faithfulness. Never once did he fail, and he never will. This is our God, this is who he is. He loves us. This is our God, this is what he does. He saves us. He bore the cross, beat the grave. Let heaven and earth proclaim, this is our God, King Jesus. Who pulled me out of that pit? He did, he did. Who paid for all of our sin? Nobody but Jesus. Who paid me out of that pit? He did, he did. Who paid for all of our sin? Nobody but Jesus. Who rescued me from that grave? Yahweh, Yahweh. Who gets the glory and praise? Nobody but Jesus. Who rescued me from that grave? Yahweh, Yahweh. Who gets the glory and praise? Nobody but him. This is our God, this is who he is. He loves us. This is our God, this is what he does. He saves us. He bore the cross, beat the grave. Let heaven and earth proclaim, this is our God, King Jesus. He bore the cross, beat the grave. Let heaven and earth proclaim, this is our God, King Jesus.
Good morning. Welcome to Fairhaven Christian Church. Welcome online. I have 3 things I have to tell you. I'm always getting very nervous if I have to make announcements and things like this, so bear with me. So the first thing I want to tell you about is VBS, Save the Date. It starts June 12th through the 16th. Registration is online, and I want to give a shout out to all those awesome volunteers. And if you have never volunteered, you should, because there is so much you can gain from that. You can see the kids interacting with each other, learning with each other, all about Jesus, and in a fun way. They have awesome snacks. You volunteers get some of those too. So if you have time and if you feel like this is something you would like to try, I encourage you to do that. The second thing I'm supposed to remind you of is Sunday Fun Day. It's going to be June 4th. It's after church. That is also the Sunday where the kids will move up. If they're in kindergarten, they go to first grade, and however that works. And after service, there's going to be a big party outside with food and fun and games and lots of things for your kids to hang out together. And the third thing I'd like to let you know about is Senior Sunday. It's going to be a little bit different this year. It's going to be May 21st. Tana, our youth minister, is going to be preaching. And I don't know if you noticed we have lots of teens that are on our worship team, and sadly some of them are seniors, so they're graduating, and they are going to lead worship for you that Sunday. So great opportunity to see our high schoolers. They have put on quite a few great worship nights, so you don't want to miss that. And of course, we're going to recognize our graduates that Sunday. So if you have a graduate and you haven't put in their name, make sure to let Tanner know that he has them on their register. All right, I think that was all the announcements. You are the brave ones that braved that rainy weather that we got today after that beautiful day yesterday. So find somebody you haven't seen yet and tell them a very happy Sunday.
drawing near as I worship. Held within your love, the winds or waves will come, but I will stay here. I lift my hands to heaven, hear my heart surrender. Tell my soul again, you are Lord of all. Though the seas are raging, you will speak and tame them. And you I find my rest, you are in control.
So I've always enjoyed going to caves. Now, here's the thing. I'm not a spelunker. Spelunker is the kind of person that puts on knee pads and a helmet and crawls around like on their belly through a tight cave. That's not what I mean when I mean caves. What I mean by I like to do caves is where you pay somebody like $20 and then they take you on a path with electric lights in the cave, right? And that's more my kind of caving. And if you've ever done caving like that, I don't want to call it the real caving, but if you've ever done caving like that, then you'll know there's something they tell you over and over and over again as you're in the cave. They tell you this. They say, don't touch the walls. Don't touch the walls. And I think there's various reasons for it. There's stuff like bacteria on your hands that can, damage the little living organisms that are in the cave. And I think deep down they just know that like children and people with childish hearts like mine will go, a rock like that costs $25 up in the gift shop. And just put it in it's a lot cheaper to just, take a rock. And so I think that's the reason why they tell you not to do it. But if you've ever been in one of these caves and you're going through and they tell you, hey, don't touch the rocks, you'll damage the caves and everything. If you inevitably, you'll come up upon sections where either people just aren't listening. Maybe it's like a tough area, you got to like do one of these things to get around like a rock or something, and you see where people, rules or not, have been sort of touching the rock to get around, or sometimes there are areas where they'll say, you are allowed to touch this. And what you notice is that in those areas, whether because you're allowed or because it's just as clear that people have been doing it, you'll notice the rock is different. Like it's smooth in a way that the cave rock isn't, and the way that it's holding moisture even is different. Like we could say this, that thousands and thousands of people over time touching the rock just for a split second has caused it to change. It's caused it to change. That repetitive over and over again of touching has created change in the rock. So we began a series a few weeks ago. We're in the 4th of 5 weeks in this series called Making It Stick. And here's the question we're looking at. How do we find real and lasting change in our lives? We all look at our lives and we notice areas in our lives that we wish were different, things we could change. Maybe they're physical changes, like things about our body, or maybe relational changes, like the quality of our marriage, or maybe spiritual changes, like reliance, that's the right word, reliance on the Lord. And we look at these changes that we wish we could make in our lives, and we notice, okay, we have the desire to change, but we don't seem to have the power to change. And so over the course of this series, we have been considering, okay, how has God made our hearts and our minds and our bodies and our souls? How has he made us to function so that we find real lasting change and, maybe more importantly, make it stick? So that's where we've been over the past couple weeks. I'll tell you where we're going. We'll finish up next week with how God's involvement in this looks. And then starting after graduation Sunday, which is the 21st, on the 28th, Memorial Day weekend, we will start the book of Acts. And we're going to be in the book of Acts for a long, long time. So you'll get very familiar with the book of Acts. I think you'll enjoy it as we get there. But that's where we're heading. This week, we're on week 4. Next week, week 5. And then Senior Sunday, and then the book of Acts. Have you ever looked at someone and you thought to yourself, that person is just lucky? Maybe it was somebody at work, right? They were at the right spot at the right time, and they did something in front of the boss who noticed, and just all of a sudden they were pushed into the limelight, and you're like, how does that happen to them? And why does something like that never happen to me? You ever feel like that? You just look at somebody and you're like, that person is just so lucky. Well, interestingly, some researchers set out to try to figure out, okay, what makes successful people successful? Here's what's fascinating about this. Before I tell you, what's fascinating about this is that they used the most completely broad definition of success that you could possibly imagine. They said, whatever you think success is, in whatever industry or field or aspect you want to talk about. There is a universal truth that they found connected between any element of success in any industry, any aspect, any field, whether it be physical or work or financial success, however you want to think about it. This is so broad and yet so specific to success that you can apply it to anything. Here's what they found. They found that successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. That's the difference between success, not luck. The people they looked at, they researched all different industries and fields, and they found, by and large, these people weren't lucky. They weren't in the right spot at the right time. They were simply doing consistently what others do occasionally. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because consistency gives us power to change. This is why sports teams drill fundamentals. Like, consider this. If you've ever been to an NBA game or a pro football game or MLB game, and like you're sitting there before the game starts, and you see elite athletes who are the best of the best in the entire world, with trainers who are the most knowledgeable and adept at getting the most out of an athlete, teaching them once again how to dribble, how to pass, to catch with two hands. The drilling of the fundamentals. Why? Because doing consistently what others do occasionally is the difference between success. We saw this last week in the scriptures as we looked at Daniel. What was the piece of Daniel's life that made a difference for him? Daniel, scripture tells us, consistently prayed. He made it a consistent point. Even when it became illegal, he went and did what he always did, praying 3 times. It was a few years ago when Steph Curry, who plays in California, Golden State Warriors, he started, you may remember this, he started just like pulling up shots, like 5, 10, 15 feet behind the three-point line, right? And he just come back and he's just making them one after another. And it was sort of just crazy because people were sitting there going, okay, if we press the defense and try to stop him from taking a shot 10 feet behind the line, then you got a wide open field to just pass it to somebody and they're going to make the shot and they'll score. And if we don't guard him, he's just going to keep making these all day long. Well, something really fascinating happened once Steph Curry started doing that. What happened was, you could see this at all levels of play, particularly at younger levels. You start seeing kids and college athletes, and even some pros, pulling up shots 10 feet behind the line. And you're like, you can't even get the ball to the hoop. What are you doing? Well, what they're doing is they saw Steph Curry shooting 10 feet behind the line and thought, that works, I should do that. But what they didn't see was Steph Curry practicing when he was just a boy and a teenager and a young man with his dad, who is also a pro NBA player, who was all the time pulling up shots. Steph Curry was practicing pulling up tens of thousands of shots 10 feet behind the line as a young man. They didn't see all of the practice that led to him being able to do that. You see, successful people do consistently what others do occasionally. This means that the seemingly small and insignificant things that you are doing today is shaping who you will be and where you will be tomorrow. Think about this for a moment. If you look at your life, just consider your life for a few moments, and you think about the last 10 years, so from 2013 to 2023. In the last 10 years, ask yourself this question. It's a yes or no question. If we're in your mind, am I different? Have I changed? Am I different? Do I think differently? Do I have different passions or skills? Do I have different abilities? Am I a different place in life? Have I changed in the past 10 years? Arguably, I think we could all say, yes, we have changed. We are different people from what we were 10 years ago. Here's what's fascinating, is that we look back on our lives and we say 10 years backwards, I look at my life and I see that I have changed. And yet, we look forward into our lives 10 years and our minds lie to us and tell us we will be the same people in 10 years from now that we are right now. Even though we know that we've changed in the past 10 years, we lose track that we can change in the next 10 years. So the question is, what makes the difference of where we go in 10 years from now? Well, if what we're talking about here is true, if what we're talking about is true, then the decisions that we're making today are pointing our life in a direction for who we will be and where we will be in the future. You see, your life today is shaping your tomorrow. Turn with me in your Bibles to Galatians chapter 6. That's where we'll be. We're going to see Paul give us some very practical, insightful thoughts in this very topic. So while you're getting there, Galatians, I'll give you the 30-second explanation of Galatians. Paul is writing to the churches in Galatia, and he is hot because they have taken Christianity, or they've taken, maybe more aptly said, belief in Jesus, and they have added into that various elements of Jewish faith. In other words, they say you can't be a believer of Jesus unless you're also doing some certain things that it meant to be a Jewish person following the law. Well, Paul's like, this is not what I told you, and he is not happy about it. He by and large, he's pretty feisty. And so one of the things that he does in Galatians is he gives some fiery information, but he also just sort of goes like right at it. It's like, here's some stuff you got to be doing, you got to be thinking. Like there's some really practical stuff in Galatians, and part of it, I think, is Paul is he's just so angry. He's like, I'm not spending time with the flowery stuff. Blah, 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 blah. And so that's Galatians for you. Now, Paul's going to be, as he's closing out this book, he's giving them some instruction in regards to how they live, how they think, how they act, and he's going to show us something here that is, again, just immensely practical, and I want to share it with you today. So let's look Galatians chapter 6. We'll start in verse 7. Paul says this: "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Paul says, don't lie to yourself. Don't be deceived. Don't lie to yourself. We'll come back to that in a second, but he says, what are we to not lie to ourselves about? We're not to lie about this, that what we sow determines what we reap. Make sure we're all on the same page. To sow is to put seeds into the ground. To reap is to then harvest what grew from the seeds we put in the ground. All right, so he says, don't be deceived. Don't lie to yourself here. God is not going to be mocked. In other words, you're not going to get away with something that anybody else is not getting away with. You're not going to be the exemption. You're going to reap, you're going to pull out of the ground what you sowed, what you put in. See, we all have good intentions. We all have good intentions. We have good intentions about our lives and our relationships and our health and our finances. We all have good intentions. But good intentions don't determine the direction in life, our direction in life. Our actions do. And this is what Paul's telling us. He says what you put into the ground is going to determine what you sow. You cannot sow something different. On Friday, I put cucumber seeds into the ground. I am not anticipating tomatoes to grow from those seeds. I'm anticipating cucumbers. You cannot, don't lie to yourself, Paul says, you cannot put into the ground one thing and pull out something different. And this means that if we put junk into our lives, we are going to sow junk we're going to reap junk out of our lives. Look what he says, verse 8. He says, whoever sows to please their flesh, from their flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Paul speaks a truth here that is like gravity. It's a law. He's like, you may not like it. You may disagree with it. You can argue with me about it, he says. But here's what's going to happen. If you jump, gravity's going to pull you down. And if you sow a seed, that's what you're going to reap. It's a law that we can't escape. In the same way, this law applies to us. Paul tells us every single time this is what happens. And our temptation is to lie to ourselves and tell ourselves, I can sow one thing but reap something different. Let me give you some practical examples of this. I want this to be practical for you, so let me give you a couple practical examples of this very thing. So, like a guy checks out every hot girl that he sees. he flirts with the girls at work. Not too much to get in trouble, but enough that it's clear what he's doing. He's online looking at stuff that he shouldn't be looking at. And then he wakes up one day, he's like, my marriage is kind of terrible. I can't connect with my wife. And he thinks, what's going on? Why is this happening? A mom lambasts everybody constantly around her for their parenting, their discipline, the way they talk to their kids. Then she looks at her life and goes, I don't have any friends. Parents spend 18 years teaching their children that church is not a priority, that sports and travel and sleeping in, that these things are a priority over church. And then we wonder why they get to 18 years old and they don't make church a priority. If I'm stepping on some toes, I'm hitting mine too. I'm just saying, like Paul's saying, we are going to lie to ourselves, left up to our own devices. We will tell ourselves that we can sow one thing, but reap something else. And Paul says, no, it doesn't work that way. What you sow is what you reap. Paul says, don't lie. Don't lie to yourself. See, every decision that we are making is directing our lives. It's going in some direction. It's shaping who we will be, for example, 10 years from now. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to know your future? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to go, hey, I know exactly where my life is going, to be able to know our future. Here's the fascinating thing about this. And I'll use myself as an example here, but you can do this too, and in fact, you've done it before. I could sit down with you, and I could ask you, I don't know, a handful of questions, just 4 or 5 questions. I could ask you a few questions and then just listen to you talk for, let's say, a half hour to an hour. And at the end of that hour, I could tell you with reasonable confidence where you're going to be in 10 years. I could tell you, are you going to be in more debt or less debt? Are you going to be physically healthier or not? Are you going to have stronger relationships with those closest to you or not? Are you going to have a deeper trust and faith in God or are you not? And this is not because I have some superpower. You do the same thing, right? You look at people you know, people that are in your life, and you look and you tell yourself those decisions that they're making are not good for them. They are not leading them where they think they're going to lead them. We've all done this in other people's lives. We've looked and said, no, that's not good. And yet somehow we've built a wall so where we don't do this in our lives, where we look at our lives and say, am I pointing my life in a direction of where I want to go or not? See, we've all done this before. It's not some magical superpower. It's a hard truth. What I sow is what I reap. Let me throw down something for you here that is... I think it's hard to hear, but it's inescapable, and it's something that we need to hear. You know, sometimes we look at our lives, and particularly when our lives go haywire, and I've done this. Like, I'm literally guilty of this myself. I look at my life when things don't go the way I think they should. I feel like I'm getting a raw deal, or God's not holding up his end of the bargain, or for whatever reason, I'm just under the gun from him, and he's out to get me, right? And you look, like your life goes haywire, your relationships go haywire, your problems with your work, and you think to yourself, okay, how can God be so good and let all this stuff happen to me? Have you ever been there? Am I the only one? Am I the only one that's ever thought about this going, okay, God, you're good and you're powerful and you're mighty. Why are all these terrible things happening? And then we come to this conclusion. God must either not be as powerful and strong as he says he is, or maybe he just doesn't love me like he says he does. You ever been there? All right, here's the hard one to hear. Often, life is not a punishment, it's a harvest. That's the hard thing to hear. It's less of a punishment and more of a harvest. Galatians 6:8, what's it say? Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. God will not be mocked. We reap what we sow. Which means if I don't like what I'm reaping right now, you got to change what you're sowing. Because the harvest that's coming in the future is a harvest that I'm not going to like. And it's going to be the same harvest that I keep getting that I don't like if I don't change the seeds. Now, here's the thing about this. Before we move on, this is imperative. And the reason is it is not just that we harvest, we reap what we sow, but there is another aspect to this agricultural illustration that Paul gives us that we cannot miss because it will help us see the importance of doing this now. You see, when you plant seeds, like think about this with, I know some of you are farmers, right? So you'll know this. You may correct me here because I may not have the data exactly right, but think about it. You take a kernel of corn, one kernel, and you put it into the ground, and from that kernel of corn grows a stalk of corn, the plant, with an ear of corn, maybe 2 ears of corn. I looked up and I asked the question, okay, how many kernels are on an ear of corn? And they vary, probably depending on a lot of factors, but between 500 and 1,200 kernels of corn can't come from the one that you put into the ground. Here's what this means. It means what we sow has a cumulative effect. This is why this is so imperative. When I look at my life right now, my circumstances, my situations, if I don't like what I'm sowing, the imperative is to do something right now, because what I will reap in the future is not just what I sowed, but it is accumulation of what I have sown. It will grow exponentially in my life. In his book, Atomic Habits, I mentioned this, James Clear's Atomic Habit book a couple times. He writes this. He says, time magnifies the margin between success and failure. It will multiply whatever you feed it. Good habits make time your ally. Bad habits make time your enemy. Listen to C.S. Lewis's quote. This is a quote from Mere Christianity. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. He says, this is why the little decisions you make today have such infinite importance. The smallest act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later, you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. And an apparent trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or a railway or a bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack, otherwise impossible. That kind of gives some context to what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27, when he says, do not give the devil a foothold. These little choices today can give the devil a foothold, which leads to a reaping of a harvest that we don't desire, and not just a harvest of what have already sown, but an accumulated harvest. What we do every day is turning you and I into the people that we will become and leading us to the life that we will live 10 years from now. You see, what you do consistently makes all the difference because it accumulates. Look at verse 9, because there's one other thing here that we need to see. Not only does what we sow accumulate, but look at verse 9, let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. You see, not only do we reap what we sow, not only do we reap an accumulation of what we sow, but we reap in a future season. I planted those seeds, I told you on Friday. I will not go home from church today and anticipate to see fully grown cucumber plants and fruit on the vine. Why? Because we always reap in a future season. You see, the actions that we take today, the seeds that we are sowing today, is for a harvest which is in the future. And the things that seem and may feel insignificant today because they're not something that's having an effect that we can measure at this moment, has an accumulation effect, has a future harvest at hand. And when we see that harvest, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do I like the seeds I put into the ground back when I put them in? You see, Paul says, if we do not give up, we will reap a harvest in the proper time. I've recommended to you this book a couple different times during this series. It's been a primary resource for me as I've been putting and developing this series. It's Pastor Craig Groeschel's book, The Power to Change. I know some of you have picked it up. It's a great book. You'll see some of the stuff we've been talking about in there. He writes about a concept of this, an illustration maybe is a better way of saying, about this topic. And I want to share it with you because I think that it helps describe what we're talking about. So he says, okay, listen, if you put a pot of water on the stove to boil and you turn on the heat, that water starts at, whatever room temperature is, let's say 70 degrees. And that water starts at 70 degrees and you begin applying heat to that water begins to warm up. The problem is that water looks the same at 90 degrees and 100 degrees and 150 degrees, right? You've put heat into this water and it just keeps looking the same. In fact, that water looks the same all the way until 211 degrees. At 211 degrees, the water looks exactly like it did when you put it in the pot at 70 degrees. There is no difference visually from what you can see in that water. It looks and acts the same. And then the water hits 212, and it erupts in a boiling action. Today, you are dumping heat energy into your life. With each decision you make, the seeds that you are sowing are dumping heat energy into your life. And the temptation, it's easy. We look at this change in our lives and we go, it's easy to be excited about it for a day or a week or a month or a couple months, for a season. And then we get weary. We give up because we're not seeing the seeds producing the harvest that we want. But Paul says, verse 9, he says, listen, we will reap the harvest in the proper time if we don't give up. So here's the question. What if you give up on your marriage at 211 degrees? What if you give up on eating healthy at 211 degrees? What if you give up praying for your wayward child at 211 degrees? What if you give up on the relationship at 211 degrees? Listen, you do not reap until long after you sow. So here's the best practical advice I could give you today. I tried to end each of these sermons with something practical. Stop judging your success on what you're reaping and judge it by what you're sowing. See, what you'll reap is way down out in the future. It's easy to be discouraged. It's easy to lose track of the harvest that you can't see yet. But you can measure today what you're sowing. Let me just real quickly, practically give you an example of this in my life. I heard a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, all the staff, we went to a retreat together, or a conference together, and we heard a saying. It was just a little passing blurb, and I heard it, and it has stuck in my mind and has changed something about my morning routine since then. Here's what the person said. He said, I'm not going to read the bad news until I've read the good news. What he's talking about is waking up and turning on the news, right? Whatever news agency you like to go to. I'd wake up, first thing I'd do, I'd open up Fox News and I'd sit there and look, and I'd read the bad news before I ever read the good news. So you know what I started doing? I told some guys that I'm accountable to last week. I said, here's what I'm going to do. Every day, I am not going to read the bad news until I've tempered my heart with the good news. I've done that every day. It's an easy thing. What am I doing? I'm sowing a seed. I don't know the effect that it has 10 years down the road, but I can granularly or evaluate, did I read the bad news before I read the good news? The seeds that we sow. If you only judge your success on what you're reaping, then you have a very limited window that is far down to be able to see whether or not you're doing consistently what others do occasionally. But the definition of success, as we've talked today, is doing consistently what others do occasionally. Every seed you're putting in the ground will produce a harvest. Let me give you a practical example of this in my life. So I mentioned during the Ready Initiative, as we were talking about this Ready Initiative to get us ready to just receive more people as our community continues to grow, one of the things that I mentioned was a goal that Sabrina and I had been working on in our family, our kids, for a number of years, few years. And the goal was we were working through Dave Ramsey's baby steps, and we were at the point that we were working to pay off our house. And so we had a couple $100,000 mortgage, probably like a lot of you. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, where can we squeeze life out of every penny to put more towards our mortgage? And so I look back in my sort of spreadsheet that I tracked all this. I noticed the smallest deposit that I ever made. We one time made $121.96 extra payment for the month against the loan. And you sit there and you go, well, what does $196 do on a $200,000 mortgage? Well, technically something, but practically nothing. Here's what we have, though. Here's what it does. This is our, it's kind of ratty and old because we need to frame it. We just haven't yet because I'm still cheap. But this is, you may not be able to see it, but this is a picture of a house, sort of an outline. There's a door and a couple windows. And here's what we would do. These little blocks all represent $250 increments. And we would literally take every penny, literally every penny that we would find, side hustle to get, and we put it against our mortgage. And then we would color in the blocks. You see sometimes we'd use different colors to help differentiate block to block. But sometimes we'd have a particular windfall. And sometimes, like I look at this little one here, there's a half a block. That's not very much. I don't know how this sowing and reaping thing works. I just know it does. I can't describe how. I just know it does. You can do this in your life. Who you want to be 10 years from now, it's obtainable. But it depends on the seed you put in the ground. And don't lie to yourself. God will not be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Lord, we give you thanks for this day that you have given us, through your word, such practical advice, truth, law. We lie to ourselves. That's the whole reason Paul said, don't lie to ourselves. Don't deceive ourselves. We lie to ourselves, Lord. You see it. You know when we do this. We sit there and we tell ourselves we're planting something different than we are. Or we tell ourselves that it'll be different for us and we won't reap what every other person has reaped that has planted the seed we planted. So, Lord, we need you to reveal in our hearts where we're lying to ourselves. Father, that's our prayer today. Would you reveal in our hearts where we have deceived ourselves? We don't know how this whole sowing and reaping thing works, why it works so perfectly each time, why it accumulates, why it comes in a future season. Like it's stuff that's hard to wrap our minds around, but we see it work. We see it be true. So reveal in our hearts, Father, that we might live for you more and more each day, sowing the seeds of life, of righteousness, of holiness, of goodness, the fruits of the Spirit, as Paul would call them. Would you teach us that? Reveal in our hearts in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please stand with us. We're getting ready for communion. Welcome by a melody. as we're getting ready for communion, I just want to remind you we have 2 communion stations up front and 2 in the back. And there's a double cup system, the wafers on the bottom, the juice on the top, so make sure you grab both of them. So I actually had planned a different devotional for our communion, but I really liked Brian's analysis of the boiling pot, and it may have to do that I got a new fancy electric kettle yesterday where it actually shows the temperature when it boils. So it really connected in my head this morning. And as we had the privilege yesterday to attend graduation at IU and saw 1,000 students, well actually IU was 20,000 students, and at IU Indy graduating 1,000 students, it hit with me with that seed. Each one of those students had somebody that helped them sow a seed that grew them into the person that they become, that they had that faith and that strength to stick through that graduation after how many years it took them to get there. And that faith that they had and that they have been taught to stick to themselves to get through that process, that's that faith that we need to have in God to help us to be faithful in our life to Him. And that's something I struggle with, because on Sundays when you have a wonderful service and you come home and you're just so strong in your faith, but by Wednesday something comes up in your regular life where you're already like, how did that happen? I'm not there where I was on Sunday evening. So this is something that I pray for all of us, that we keep that faith that we have on Sunday, that we in church, the same on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, that we just keep that and be strong in our faith. So if you pray with me, please. Lord, I want to thank you for implanting that faith in us. Even some days are weaker and some days are stronger, but you're always there to get that back into our mind. You will never leave us. You never forsake us. You're there in whatever situation we have going on. And even though we forget about that, you will not waver from your faith. And as we're going into communion, I want to thank you that you sent your Son to us to take away our sin faithfully for all the sin that we ever have or not. In your Son's name I pray. Amen. Sermon. I surely did. And if you please stand with us, we're going to have one more song before we head out for the